And we are striving to walk in the paths that Christ has given us. And that's kind of where we began last week. We talked about the kingdom as being a present, and we dealt with that idea of being present in the kingdom. You see, you and I, we can't just kind of, fill out a card and somehow be accepted into, membership. And that's really all we need to do. It's not as if it's like, that Christmas gift in a technical sense where, someone gives it to us and we receive it and that's about it. We must be present. We must be active. There's a part for us to play in all of it. And as I promised last week, we are going to be dissecting the idea of this greatest gift, this greatest present that God has given us. This morning we want to kind of take it one step further. One step further. Imagine the kingdom as a present. And just like most presents, it is wrapped in something. It is wrapped in something. Now, if you're getting a present from me, it's probably not going to look, really, really pretty. I'm not the best wrapper in the world. I'm not the best one. That could be, okay. And anyhow, I'm not... It's not one of my skills, let's put it that way. There are a lot of people who, they wrap things and, man, you're wondering where they learned to do it. And it's a marvelous, amazing type of thing. Some people not so skilled at that. But this kingdom that we're talking about, the idea of the kingdom, together, it has a wrapping. It has a wrapping, and that wrapping can be summed up in a couple of different ways, with probably a couple of different words, but this morning, we're simply going to use one word. One word. Have you ever had one of those days that it's kind of like that old cartoon? You may remember this cartoon. It's like the washing machine is talking to the refrigerator, and the refrigerator is talking to the car, and the heading of it, or the little caption at the bottom says, "Okay, now 1, 2, 3, die." You ever had that kind of week? Where everything around you seems to kind of go, wrong and kind of fly out the window, and you find yourself put into all of these situations that, you weren't expecting, number one, but kind of, put you to the task. And you think, man, it all came at once. And the more you think about it, you realize that it really didn't all come at once, did it? This whatever went wrong with the car, or whatever went wrong with the light, or we kind of had one of those weeks sort of last week. Several things went wrong at the same time. But they don't really happen all at once, do they? I mean, usually if we're kind of honest with ourselves, it happens over the slow course of time. It happens, and we see it taking place little by little by little by little, and we come up with little fixes here and little fixes there, and we kind of get it limping along, put the Band-Aid on, and then, unfortunately, all that buys us is a bigger mess, because now everything, I don't know why, but it does. It seems like sometimes it just all goes wrong at the same time. As if somebody went around and collectively pulled off all of the Band-Aids on all of the projects that we had that we simply put them on. People are kind of the same way, though. People don't just go down a wrong path like that. Things just don't go wrong in the lives of individuals or the lives of, God's spiritual family like that. It happens over the course of time. Because we as individuals are made up of various pieces. We are complex beings that have thoughts, have emotions, and have all of these different things that are going on inside of us and outside of us that shape and mold who we are. And while at times it may seem as if things appear in our personality or things appear in our behavior overnight, typically that is not the case. They are developed over the course of time. By small and incremental steps. And here's the great thing. Knowing that's the case, knowing that we can shape and mold who we are, is certainly a wonderful gift, because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the wrapping that is on the outside of the gift. We'll get to what's underneath in later lessons, but What kind of life do you have now? What does your life look like? Spiritual life. I mean, is it everything that you thought it would be? I mean, do we look at our spiritual lives and we say, this is exactly what I expected? Way back when I find out, or maybe just a short time ago, or whenever it was that you found yourself, seeking this relationship with God, seeking this relationship with His kingdom. When you heard those things, look back on it now and you ask, is it everything that you thought it would be? Much of the answer you will give is simply a function of the attitude that you possess. And that one little word kind of sums up what you and I this morning are calling wrapping on the present, the gift that God has given us. Some people would say this: attitude is everything. I remember hearing that over and over as I grew up. Various people, from teachers to parents to other folks, especially in those times when you're displaying an improper attitude, would simply come to you and they would say things like, attitude is everything. In those moments when you're thinking, oh, it can't be done. I'm destined to fail. We'll never do this, and we can't do that. There's always that wise person who comes in and tells you, attitude is everything. Is everything. And when it comes to this body of believers, when it comes to the kingdom, the same is true. Attitude is everything. Now, attitudes come deep from within us, and they filter into our behaviors. And that's why we're calling them the wrapping. What do other people see? What kind of example are we setting? And I'm not the one that labeled it that way. If you go to the Bible and you look at the description of the children of God, what you realize is that this kingdom has a very outward-focused presence in this world. We've used the words time and time again in the course of this series of lessons. But remember those passages that talk about, light unto the world, the city that's set on a hill. You are the salt of the earth. All of those things talk about that outward presence of the body of Christ, or of the kingdom of Christ. So what is it? What is the nature of that light? How is it that we are salt, or are we something other than that? Sometimes when things go wrong, when attitudes are incorrect, we kind of like to lay the blame at other people's feet. This is something that's come from the beginning. Genesis chapter 3, beginning with verse 12 and 13, you remember the passing of the buck that occurs there. Well, it's the woman that you gave me. No, it was the serpent in the garden. And we kind of pass the blame for, why we're not reaching our spiritual potential on to other people. Well, how come this isn't happening in my spiritual life? And how come this isn't part of, the kingdom that I'm a part of? And how come this is? And the big question is maybe it's not a part of it because you're not bringing it. We pass the blame, but sometimes it just simply comes down to our attitudes. If you go over to Matthew chapter 27, verses 3 through 8, you find this short account that basically is the lead-in to the end of a guy by the name of Judas. After Judas, he hands over Christ. He's paid his, 30 pieces of silver. He regrets it, and he goes back. He goes back to that temple complex. He takes the money and he throws it into the temple. Basically, as if to say, you guys, the blame is on your feet. Here's your money back, and you now take the blame. And you remember the Bible tells us that they refused. They refused to take that money and put it into the coffers. It's as if it was, accepting the blame. This is blood money. This is guilt money. And nobody seemed to want a part of it. Well, the same thing is true in our day and age, especially when it comes to the idea of attitude. Many people, most people, I would dare say, are not real good at accepting their part. But the simple fact of the matter is that we choose these things. We choose our attitudes because we choose our thoughts and experiences. You choose your grades, you choose your college, you choose your job, you choose your husband or wife, attitudes, circumstances, history, and all of these other things. You choose your success. You choose whether or not you will be a successful and working member of the kingdom. And by that, you choose what that kingdom is going to look like. We can't blame others. We can't blame situations because we control it. You know, it's funny, and the reason I mention all of this is because there's this tendency to dismiss these types of things. I once knew of an individual, let's just call him Joe, for the sake of argument. Joe, from the time that I was the smallest of boys and can remember anything about him, walked around as if he had just eaten the sourest dill pickle known to mankind. Never had a nice thing to say, never looked on the positive side, always sitting in the back of the auditorium, looking for things that go wrong, waiting for the moment to pounce, always ready with the criticism, and he was free about offering it. This fellow had a bad attitude. Matter of fact, it was the most horrible attitude that you could ever imagine. And he was more than willing to dish it out in large doses to anybody who could stand for a moment's time to be around him. And he was a member of the same church for years. For years. And every once in a while, people would ask the question, why is he like that? And instead of being honest about it, instead of being honest and saying something along the lines of, well, he's not being very Christ-like, or he hasn't fully learned that the kingdom of Christ is a place of joy and transformation, and expecting old Joe to actually grow in those things, we'll say something kind of like this. Well, that's just Joe. That's just who he is. As if Joe couldn't change it. Joe did change a little bit near the end of his life. One time there was a young boy, and they were playing in the hall, and the young boy was, in Joe's eyes, doing something wrong, and he grabbed the young boy by the arm and started to lecture him, and the young boy, as sometimes young boys will, opened his mouth and said perhaps one of the wisest things that Joe had ever heard. He said the thing that the adults should have been saying to Joe. And the little boy just looked up at him and said, "Mister, why are you so hateful?" And I guess maybe Joe thought a little bit. Thought maybe, you know what, I am responsible. I do control my attitude. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote these words. He says, "Action springs not from thought, but from a deep sense of personal responsibility." See, before you can have the proper thoughts, you have to have the proper perspective about them. That is, you have to be willing to assume responsibility for your thoughts. Just like you assume responsibility for the words that come out of your mouth from the thoughts that you have. Just like you assume responsibility for the attitudes that are displayed based upon the thoughts that you have, which is often manifest in words. A guy by the name of T.S. Eliot said this: if you haven't the strength to impose your own terms upon life, you must accept the terms it offers you. A very nice and creative way of saying, you're responsible for your life. You are responsible for your attitude. And this morning, the entire lesson, if you take nothing else away, if you walk away for the bulk of the lesson, you're scratching your head saying, what was that guy talking about? Take this with you. You choose your attitude. And then once you realize that, ask yourself the question as you go to your car and as you're on your way home, whether or not you got anything out of the lesson or not, ask yourself the question, is my attitude the attitude of Christ? Because after all, it's his kingdom, and you're in it. And you choose it. So what will it be? We choose our attitudes. The chief of all sinners, Paul, calls himself that. We're not calling him that. Paul proclaims himself to be the chief of all sinners. Didn't let his downfall affect, didn't let his past, didn't let the fact that he had murdered Christians, or at least been a party to it, affect his attitude once he became a child of God. See, because Paul realized that everything changes when you become a Christian. All things, Paul would write, become new. And in Philippians chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, Paul wrote, "This one thing I do." What is that one thing, Paul? He pressed forward, pressed constantly toward the mark to attain, and I'm paraphrasing, to the high calling. In our language that we're using today, Paul constantly strove, overcoming his past, overcoming his history, overcoming the fact that he was the chief of all sinners, to have the attitude, the disposition, the thoughts, the ways of Christ. You are responsible for how you view your life. Go over to the book of Galatians chapter 6, just very quickly. Galatians chapter 6. I want us to read just a couple of verses. We're going to do verses 7 through 9. Paul, again, writing, says this, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will reap from the flesh, reap corruption. Will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary in doing good, but in due season we will reap if we do not give up." We are responsible for how we view our life. We are responsible, and God is going to hold us accountable. Are we growing weary? Do we have a poor attitude? How much of our life has been wasted with poor attitudes? I mean, how much of our life has been wasted looking at life through these blackened lenses that perceives everything as poor me, or as the most negative and abhorrent situation that anybody possibly could live in? I mean, do we always see ourselves at the bottom of the ladder, on the lowest rung, somehow not blessed as much as other people? I mean, what is our disposition? And how much time have we wasted in poor and negative attitudes? How many jobs lost? Promotions not gained? Ministries undone? Because we simply chose a poor attitude. Paul again in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice." Words written while Paul was an imprisoned man making his way toward an inevitable death. Paul was in his journey towards that death. And yet his disposition, his attitude was, "Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice." What an amazing disposition. What an amazing attitude. But we look back and we say, well, how could that be? How could Paul do it? I'll go over there just very quickly. Paul kind of explains, why he could. Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4. Go with me to, it's actually about halfway through the chapter. Paul says this, he says, "Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need." And then verse 13, he says this, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." And I'm pretty sure that when Paul said that, he was including the idea of changing our attitude and our outlook on life. Simple fact of the matter is you can go from being the negative, pessimistic, angry, bitter person to being someone who is fully embracing the joy of life like Paul did. Because, see, that's what the kingdom is all about. And that's what God expects his people to display to the world. The city on the hill, the salt of the earth. That's what God expects. You can tailor your kingdom success by the proper attitude that you display. John Maxwell, a Christian and, well-known author of many books on leadership, said it is impossible for us to tailor-make all situations to fit our lives perfectly. But it is possible to tailor-make our attitudes to fit. You may not be able to change your situation, but you can change your attitude toward that situation. John Maxwell also wrote these words. He said, "The future only looks bright when the attitude is right. But also the present is much more enjoyable. The positive person understands that the journey is as enjoyable as the destination." But only if our attitude is correct. So again, we choose our attitudes. One more thing before we get to the things that we can change our attitude about. Have you ever noticed the quote, 7 deadly sins? Now, I know typically we don't categorize them like that, but we're going to take that category, and we're just going to look at it very quickly. Those 7 deadly sins, at least in the past, I don't know about today, but at least in the past were pride and covetous, lust, envy, anger, gluttony, and sloth. I mean, read through that list. Read through that list and you think about it. And realize one thing about every single thing that's mentioned on that list. It's not descriptions of actions. For instance, you ever notice that each and every one of them is related to an attitude, a heart condition, or a motive, rather than an action? For instance, you may notice that gluttony is not the same thing as overeating. Overeating would be the action, but gluttony is the attitude toward the food, or whatever it is that you're overly partaking in. But every single one of these 7 deadly sins has to do more with the attitude than the action that follows. Christ would talk about that in the New Testament, really in the Sermon on the Mount, when he talks about the condition of the heart. You've heard it said in these times past that, doing this was wrong. And in essence, to describe all the things he says there, he goes on to say, but I tell you that if your heart's just messed up about these things, if your thoughts are wrong about these things, then you've already started down the pathway of sin. You've already chosen. And in choosing, you have determined a certain course. But you choose. And your attitude determines a couple of things. Number one, your attitude determines how you will relate to other people. Go over to the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew in chapter 7. Of course, Matthew chapter 7 is the last chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. And most of us know this verse and know it fairly well. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. How you treat other people will be based on the attitude that you have toward them. Are we the type of people who put ourselves in other people's shoes? Are we the type of people who will extend mercy when we see that mercy needs to be extended? Have compassion when compassion needs to be part of the person's life? Do we attempt to understand people's, needs? Or do we begin more with, self and the creation of, the attitude, and other people are kind of secondary? And Matthew chapter 25 kind of demonstrates this as well. You remember the great passage about the sheep and the goats. We've mentioned this multiple times. The great passage about the sheep and the goats and how they're divided out, and the big difference that takes place between them is the attitude, really, and the willingness to serve their fellow human beings. When did we see you naked and not give you clothes? When did we see you hungry and not give you food? When did we see you in need of something and not help out? You see, if our attitude is such that we don't want to see, we don't want to experience, we don't want to entertain the needs and the desires of other people, then we're not going to. You see that today. There's tragedy and heartbreak and pain and so much of it in our world. And for the most part, most people go throughout their daily lives unaffected, kind of wearing blinders to the whole of the situation that takes place in humanity on a daily basis. It affects how we relate to other people. When our attitudes are poor, when they are pessimistic, when they are negative, it will affect how you interact with other people. I don't know about you, but I don't enjoy being around people who are constantly down. Even if it's down on themselves. It's kind of a drag. But when you choose your attitude, you choose how you relate to other people. What would happen if we treated every person we met? Just this week. I tell you what, if a week's too much, just one day. What would happen if for just one day you treated every person that you came in contact with in some meaningful way as the most important person in the world? What if we actually listened to what they had to say? What if we actually wanted to know about their life? What if we actually showed them the love of Christ? Maybe that's what you do. Maybe that's who you are. Maybe you're doing that on a continual basis. Keep on. And make many converts to it. Maybe that's not you. Maybe the attitude's not always right. I know most of us, we try, we know what to do, but sometimes we fall down and we just simply need to be reminded, hey, your attitude's not right. Second of all, your attitude will determine your success. Your attitude will determine your success. Turn it with me over to the book of Philippians in chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. We're going to read verses 3 through 8. Do nothing from selfish ambition, Paul would write. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others, having this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God to be a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. And then I want you to notice verse 9. It says, therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. It is his kingdom, and he leads it by example, and he expects us to have the same mind. The first point that Paul makes here is the first point that we made. How do you relate to other people? Are you perceiving them as first? What is your attitude toward them And how's it affecting your relationship? But then you'll notice here, too, right here at the end, he talks about success and how it hinges upon that attitude. I mean, Christ could have looked at that whole cross thing and said, "No, ain't no way. That ain't happening." And why? I mean, it was one thing, and that, sounded really good when we talked about it over here. But, now I'm down here and I'm in the flesh, and these people are undeserving. I mean, I come and I try to tell them the truth, and they don't want to hear it. They are a miserable lot. And why in the world would I sacrifice myself for them? I mean, that wasn't the attitude of Christ. Certainly not. Because he had the proper attitude, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. You know what? He tells us the same thing. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. He will lift you up. So, the same thing that's said about Christ here, that led from his attitude to serve, is the same thing that's said about us. You want to find success? You want to find that spiritual success, and the formula for it, it's right here. Summed up in the notion of having the proper attitude about his kingdom, about other people, about service, about life in general. Someone once said this: all that is well begins well. As we prepare spiritually, we must begin with the proper attitude. See, these things, this attitude that Christ had was determined beforehand. He didn't cling to that place in eternity with God, but willingly let it go. We choose our thoughts as well. You can choose where you are. You can choose your disposition to a great extent by choosing your thinking. And Paul talks about in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. Don't be pressed into the mold of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Paul there is telling us to do something. And it's the idea here of choosing your thoughts. Choosing what you put into your head. Go over to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Just very quickly. We're not going to read all of it. Excuse me, but just a couple of verses. He says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." The greatest weapon that we have against our adversary, who wants us to have this poor attitude, because it's easy, number one. Number two, because it leads to our destruction, is the taking of our own thoughts captive. You see, you can choose your thoughts. You can choose what you listen to or what you don't listen to. I love this passage back in Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 4. Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 14. Of course, it's in the midst of a description of God's people. And it says, "O Jerusalem, wash your heart from evil." They were responsible for that. You wash your heart. In other words, you've got to get rid of the evil, that you may be saved. You see, there's the part that God's going to do. He's going to lift you up, but you know what? You got to do something. And then he says this: "How long shall your wicked thoughts lodge within you?" God didn't put them there. They chose them. They chose those things. When we consciously decide to do so, to choose our own thoughts, to choose what we let influence us, you're going to have much that goes into your mind, but you choose how they influence you and what influences you. Then we'll make a bigger difference in this world, and we'll make that kingdom together a much better place. Finally, your future success is dependent upon many things, but two of the most important will be your attitude and your thoughts, which guide what it is that you do. Paul brings this out in Ephesians 4:17 through 24. We won't read it for the sake of time. But Paul says that kingdom success depends upon it. Depends upon what disposition you assume. Beginning with this conversation he has about your individual commitment to God. See, he talks about the old man, he talks about the new man. The biggest difference, or one of the biggest differences, I should say, between that old man and the new man is, the new man is the saved man. The new man is washed clean of his sins, but the new man ought to act differently and have a new disposition. The person over here who was hopeless and without purpose and meaning in this world ought to have a newfound joy because they're choosing their thoughts and they're choosing their attitudes. And maybe you're here this morning and you haven't made the choice. Maybe you've not yet entered the kingdom. Maybe you need to do that this morning by hearing His word and believing and repenting of your sins, confessing in Christ's name that He is the Son of the living God, being baptized for the remission of sins. Maybe you have done that. But maybe your attitude, your disposition has kind of moved away from where Christ would have it be. If you're here this morning and have need, we urge you to make those needs known. As together we stand and sing.
sheltering fold. Ever thy glorious face to behold. Jesus, I come to thee. Please remain standing, and our closing song will be number 85.